through so we can get to your discussion at the end. Now that we've deconstructed the word security, sadly I'm about to deconstruct the word traditional. I'm going to try to make a case that environmental change is actually a very traditional component of strategic thought. And I'll just explain what I mean by environment. So, the environment is literally the physical foundation on which we build everything else. And when we build, we assume that what was there when we built it will always be there. So these are 4 defensive fortifications from different parts of the world, built at different times. There's Edinburgh Castle in Scotland, there's a very important fort in India, there's Masada in Israel, and this is the slide that allows me to say I'm actually not American, I'm Canadian from nearby Quebec City. That's, again, one of the main forts that defended Quebec. Now, they were all built in the same sort of place for the same reasons. They're easy to defend, they're difficult to attack, but they make the assumption that the environment that was there when they were built will never change. In particular, that they will never run out of water. Now, they run out of water, they go from being very good defensive fortifications to being death traps. And in many ways, we have built our infrastructure, all of our infrastructure, assuming the environment we built into will not change. And the environment, for many reasons, including climate change, is changing. And we see that all over. This is a slide for the Air Force personnel in the audience. These are examples of 4 airport runways from around the world that have flooded in less than the last year. We're starting to see more of these sort of incidences, especially runways, because they tend to be built near the coast or in flatlands that didn't have previous habitation, largely because they were generally on floodplains. These sorts of disruptions of critical infrastructure are happening increasingly. These are very real strategic threats. This has been known for a very long time. If you look at one of the Bibles of strategic thought, you can see that Cotillia identified these issues over 2,000 years ago. He identified 3 interdependent elements to assess, that you needed to assess to plan a successful campaign. And I'm limiting this to hard military issues of campaigns, which we still need to incorporate into our strategic thought. First, you needed power. And that included military power, enthusiasm, and morale. Now, military power and morale can both be blunted by extreme weather. You have a very difficult time commanding the troops if they're up to their knees in water. Place, the sort of terrain that you deploy into. Terrain, of course, can be suddenly altered by extreme weather events or can be altered over a long period of time by changing climatic conditions. For example, in the case of India, thawing permafrost in the Himalayan region may undermine quite a bit of the infrastructure, military infrastructure on both sides of the border, including China's railway in Tibet. Very unstable. And time. Now, when do you attack? And Cotillia was talking about seasons, but the seasons are changing. Normally, we used to have kind of war seasons when you would go to war, but those seasons can still affect how we deploy. In terms of, kind of sandstorms knocking out the ability to launch missiles during the first Gulf War, heavy rain affecting, it's still a component. And Cotillia considered those 3 components interdependent, and I argue that they still are. On the other side of the border, in the art of war, you see 5. It's a much thinner volume, right? Not nearly as complete, but he still managed to find 5 elements of things that needed to be included for military action. And they included weather, terrain, discipline, including supply lines, all 3 of which we've seen can already be affected by environmental change, leadership, which is less of an issue, and politics. Now, destabilization of political structures can be caused by environmental change. We saw it in Taiwan, where the government had to resign after badly handling a typhoon, and we saw it in the U.S. with Katrina, which was a complete political disaster and caused long-term effects politically as well. So we can see that environmental change is embedded into strategic thought, even though we haven't really acknowledged it. And if we don't acknowledge it, it's not complete. And I'll give you 2 case studies to show how, in a very concrete way, environmental change is affecting our security globally. I'm going to start with something that's not normally considered an environmental issue, which is legal infrastructure. In the same way we have physically built onto the existing environment, we have written our laws assuming that the environment will not change. And a classic example of this is the law of the sea. Now, the law of the sea basically assumes that if you have a nice rectangular country with no neighbors, you get a 200-mile exclusive economic zone off your coastline. Well, what happens if your coastline floods and retreats? Does your exclusive economic zone retreat along with it? Now, this is a very serious issue for a lot of countries, including up in the Bay of Bengal area. If you have an offshore island, according to the unconventional law of the sea, it deviates your border. Well, what happens if that island disappears? You know, there was a case recently in the Gulf of Mexico where Mexico was claiming an island that would have gone up into U.S. territorial waters, or what the U.S. claimed was territorial waters. A lot of oil and gas. Big deal. Now, this island had been on maps for hundreds of years. Mexico put in the claim. The U.S. said, fine, show us the island. So the Mexican Navy went out, couldn't find the island. The Air Force went out, couldn't find the island. Satellite imagery, no island. So the Mexicans said, you know, obviously the CIA blew up our island. I think it's the only logical conclusion. And the U.S. said, doesn't matter, no island, no claim. Now, if that becomes precedent, no island, no claim, we suddenly have a completely new strategic environment, including in places like the South China Sea. Now, there's a lot of discussion about the South China Sea, but when you see what the pieces of rock those claims are based on are actually like, it sort of focuses the mind a little bit. Those little pieces of rock can anchor 200-mile exclusive economic zone around them. Now, they need to have habitation to support the claim. So those are some very unlucky Chinese soldiers anchoring very large oil and gas claims in the South China Sea. Won't take a lot of sea level rise to put them into a submarine base, basically. You see it in other areas as well. This is currently in the news. This is Japan's island actually did disappear. So they just built this superstructure on top of it and said, no, we still have an island and we're still making our 200-mile claim. If you build an artificial island, you only get a 500-meter safety zone. You don't get the 200-mile exclusive economic zone. So what is a real island and what is an artificial island is becoming quite critical. China, of course, is saying, I don't think so. So because the law hasn't incorporated environmental change into the calculations, we're starting to have completely new strategic threats. And this is in the neighborhood here. The Maldives is often in the news about potentially disappearing. This is what elevation is like in many of the Maldivian islands. Very low lying. Can be the tsunami knocked out a few of them, and if you get saltwater infiltration into the groundwater, they can really go quite quickly. Now, this is an exclusive economic zone map of the Indian Ocean, and you can see the Maldives are actually very geostrategic. The crosshash area underneath is the Diego base, which of course is highly strategic. So the question is, if the Maldives actually disappears, does it legally cease to exist as a country? Do the waters become international waters? Does it lose its seat in the UN? Would it be possible for India to take in the population of the Maldives, although currently the population of the Maldives may not be the best guests, and extend India's exclusive economic zone to incorporate those waters so that, at least from a security perspective, you don't have free passage through those waters, and perhaps, fisheries licenses could be given to the new immigrants so that they wouldn't be coming in poor and desperate. I mean, basically, there is a complete gap in the law, and it's going to take strategic foresight, incorporating environmental change, to try to figure out what to do about it. Another area which Director General Gupta mentioned this morning is the Arctic. Now, the Arctic is where the three geos, geopolitical, geoeconomic, and geophysical, are all coming together to create an entirely new security dynamic. And I would argue that the Arctic is now becoming an Asian issue. So as we're talking about Asian security, we'll talk about why the Arctic is an Asian issue. One of the reasons that the Arctic is so high on the agenda is because, according to the U.S. Geological Survey, about a quarter of the world's undiscovered oil and gas is in the Arctic. So these are undiscovered Arctic oil fields, according to the U.S. Geological Survey. These are the undiscovered Arctic gas fields, according to the U.S. Geological Survey. There's a lot up there. Now, what isn't being talked about quite so much is what's happening onshore. We know that the ice is retreating, but at the same time, the permafrost is thawing. Now, permafrost is a very thick, very hard layer of ice immediately under the surface. So on the left, you can see that kind of layer of ice, and on the right, that's a person to give you scale. That's the gray stuff is all permafrost. Now that's rock solid normally, and Canada, Russia, many other Arctic countries build directly onto the permafrost. It's our foundation. Now, the permafrost is thawing. So you're getting railways becoming unstable, buildings starting to crumble, roads starting to give way. The critical issue here, from a global perspective, because of the interconnectivity that Admiral Morissetti mentioned, is the energy infrastructure in the Arctic. I'm sorry this is not as clear as it could be, but there are major oil and gas pipelines coming out of Russia, feeding Europe, and potentially now feeding China, running through the Arctic. The black areas on that map are areas that are at high risk of severe permafrost thaw by 2050. Okay. A pipeline, like an electrical transmission line, is only as good as its weakest point. You have 3,000 kilometers of pipeline, and 1 meter goes down, you've lost your delivery system. Very unstable infrastructure. This is what those pipelines look like. A lot of them are Soviet era. They're not in great shape to begin with. There hasn't been a lot of maintenance done, and they're right on top of the permafrost. A little problematic. So, what are the geopolitics? We've talked a bit about the geophysics. What are the geopolitics of the Arctic? This is the flag that the U.S. Navy hopes will launch 1,000 icebreakers. This was an image from about 3 years ago when Russia planted their flag on the seabed on top of the North Pole. And suddenly we realized the Arctic was a strategic issue. So, politics and economics, especially in countries like Russia, are extremely tightly linked. So let's talk about some of this was from a WikiLeaks document. Of course, WikiLeaks is bad, evil, you're not supposed to quote them, but this was a great document. About a meeting between U.S. officials and Gazprom's Director of Foreign Relations about what were the corporate priorities of Gazprom versus U.S. corporate priorities for the oil and gas sector, particularly the gas sector. So the Gazprom guy said the first priority was to fulfill the gas needs of domestic, industrial, and residential consumers, and to fulfill its social obligations, which include a variety of, in effect, charitable projects throughout the country. This is a nationalist agenda, right? They're building the nation through the oil and gas supply. So the Americans said, what about maximizing shareholder value? I mean, isn't that what your corporation, isn't that what it's supposed to be about? And the Russian guy said, oh yeah, and I forgot, our other goal is to maximize control over global energy resources. These are very different approaches to natural resources, and including geopolitics into how geoeconomics is functioning and how they'll be affected by geophysical changes is really the comprehensive way of looking at global security at the moment. Now, what this has also meant is, and this is how Arctic becomes an Asian issue, is where is this Russian oil and gas going to go? We've seen that the pipelines potentially might be becoming unstable. We know Russia is ramping up its shipping. We're starting to see more shipping coming out of the region that's going to have increasing oil and gas in Russia's north. We know that there are growing oil and gas ties between Russia and China. And you can see by that route that with a thawing Arctic, China becomes a lot closer to Russia. The red route is the current route from, say, Shanghai to Rotterdam. The much shorter blue route is what will happen when it becomes increasingly navigable in the Arctic. So China has identified this and is very actively becoming an Arctic nation. That's China's icebreaker. That's China celebrating International Polar Day. They've had an active outreach program to Aboriginal communities in the Canadian Arctic, trying to put a foothold into oil and gas, uranium, all sorts of other sectors through Arctic trade. They have research stations in the Arctic and Antarctic. This is changing global politics because of geophysical changes. However, China is very advanced in some ways, but in some ways it still misses the point about how insecure they are from environmental change. This is Shanghai. On the left, that's a satellite image. Shanghai is like New Orleans. It's in a floodplain, it's subsiding, it's in a typhoon pathway. That's one of the many typhoons that goes up that coast every year. Shanghai is almost inevitably going to be hit by a major typhoon. And we've started to see problems up and down the coast. There was that chemical plant that had a breach of their containment pool not that long ago, put tens of thousands of people out onto the street. I spoke to a guy that runs a very large chemical factory up the coast. They put a chemical factory here, and a major upscale urban development in between the two. And he said to the city planners, you know, we can kill thousands of people in half an hour if this breaches. But because of the way that they're doing their development, which is, you know, a lot of short-term feedbacks for the developers and corruption locally, that coast is very dangerous and very unstable. So when you talk about China planning long-term and how geostrategic they are and all that sort of stuff, that may be true for foreign policy, but for domestic policy, there are huge vulnerabilities. So the point of all of this is, comprehensive security requires being traditional in the cotillion sense, truly understand the geo and geopolitics. Thank you.